Okay, hi everybody. America held hostage, and it looks like it's going to go on for at least another month to 3 months. So we'll try to make the best of it and see what we can do. So today I'm going to go over chapter 9. We're going to talk about the central nervous system. So the CNS includes the brain and the spinal cord, in addition to cranial nerve 2, which is the optic nerve. So we'll discuss that and see how it helps to control a lot of the major functions in the body. We'll talk about in future chapters the autonomic nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. So one of the things that we still don't know too well is how you go from a neuron to something like consciousness. So that really are the emergent properties of the nervous system. We'll go over also the anatomy of the nervous system. So the brain obviously is in the skull. The spinal cord is within the vertebral canal within the vertebrae. We'll see that from the skull it comes out of a hole in the skull called the foramen magnum. We'll see that language, memory, and other parts of the brain have been well mapped to be able to localize those particular regions. So we'll go over, for instance, the occipital cortex is concerning vision. You also have the frontal and prefrontal cortex are really the executive centers of the brain and really help to maintain our consciousness. There's even something known as the reticular activating center, which really keeps us alert and maintains all of the activity. So looking at the development of the brain when you're the embryo, when you first start developing the central nervous system, it comes from ectoderm cells. So you can see that the neural crest starts forming and you actually develop what's called the notochord, which then invaginates, and that is really going to form the basis of the brain and the spinal cord. And one of the things that's extremely important for this is the vitamins that people have, in particular folate. So one of the deficiencies that you can have, folate deficiency, if that occurs like in a pregnant woman, that can lead to malformation and closure of this notochord, which leads to a condition known as spina bifida. And with spina bifida, part of the spinal cord is literally outside of the body in the back, and that in the birthing process can get damaged and lead to problems like paralysis and paraplegia for individuals who are so affected. So it's very important that women of childbearing potential maintain their diet and take appropriate supplements that make sure that they get enough folate. And you can look up on the internet to see what foods like leafy green vegetables have folate. So if you eat a lot of salad, it may not be necessary to take those supplements, but it's always a good idea to potentially take those if you are anticipating getting pregnant. The brain also contains what are called the ventricles. There are 4 ventricles within the brain, and those are the regions that produce a substance known as cerebrospinal fluid. And we'll talk about some of the barriers that are found within the central nervous system. You have the blood-brain barrier, you also have the blood-CSF barrier, and the blood-retina barrier, which is in the eye. But remember, the eye is also part of the central nervous system, and it's the only part of the CNS that is literally visible by a physician who's doing an examination. And we'll see in chapter 10 that just by looking at the eye, physicians can literally diagnose conditions like high blood pressure, diabetes, potentially even cancers like retinoblastoma and things like that. So we'll take a look at what those abnormalities look like. So this shows the development of the brain. By 6 weeks' time, you literally start developing a primitive brain. By 11 weeks, you can see the cerebrum together with the cranial nerves, the eye, the brain stem together with the spinal cord. And in many cases, when do women find out that they're pregnant? Like, if you have conception in the middle of the month, the first time that you may notice a missed period is approximately 2 weeks, and oftentimes women spot so they don't necessarily know that they're pregnant. So it may even take 6 weeks before women can identify that they've missed a period, and by that time you've literally started to develop the central nervous system, so it may be too late if you have a deficiency like folate deficiency to prevent any malformations. And obviously things that also shouldn't be done during pregnancy include drinking or smoking, because there are characteristic effects. In fact, there's a condition known as fetal alcohol syndrome, where there's a characteristic appearance of the baby which is called the physiognomy of the baby. And smoking, for obvious reasons, also has certain conditions that are associated with it. Even if a mother is diabetic, the increase in the hormone insulin, particularly in women who have type 2 diabetes, can lead to the baby becoming extremely large, because, as we'll see in the future, insulin is actually an anabolic hormone, and it causes increased growth of the fetus. So here you see the brain as you go through development. So at 17 weeks all the way through gestation, which is 40 weeks, and it literally looks like a miniaturized version of the adult brain. But one of the characteristics of brains in children is that they continue to grow. So one of the features of the skull is that the skull allows the brain to increase its growth by not fusing what are called the cranial sutures. And we'll see that there are a number of sutures that are present in the skull, the last of which may end up fusing potentially in the individual's lifetime by the time they're 55 or 60 years of age. And the full maturation of the brain, they say, takes up to 25 years to take place. So the brain is continually developing and maturing so that you get the executive function, and really it takes that long for things to occur. So in many cases, teenagers and children end up doing stupid things, probably because they haven't got that brain that's been able to mature to have the executive function to know that those things are really stupid and you shouldn't be doing them. So you can see the newborn brain compared to the adult brain. Down at the very bottom of the brain is what's called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is particularly involved in balance and being able to stabilize yourself, but they found that it's not absolutely necessary for life, because there have been a couple of individuals who've been discovered that don't have cerebellums, and their development has been off in that it took them 4 or 5 years to be able to walk, and even after that they weren't able to stabilize themselves as well as somebody with a cerebellum, but they still do remarkably well. All right, so looking at the brain and the spinal cord, you notice that from the spinal cord you have what are called the spinal nerves that are coming out. Those spinal nerves contain both motor, autonomic, and sensory nerves, but the spinal nerves are actually part of the peripheral nervous system. And if you look, the spinal cord is literally solid all the way down to approximately L2. So at L2 you get what's called the cauda equina, or the horse's tail, that is a number of nerve fibers that are coming out, and that's literally where you do a spinal tap. If you're a physician, you are trying to collect samples of cerebrospinal fluid, and you don't want to do that where the spinal cord is whole, because potentially if the needle goes in too far, you could injure the spinal cord. But in the cauda equina, you actually have this horse's tail of individual fibers where the needle can go in between, and the physician is able to suck out some of the cerebrospinal fluid, and we'll see that that can be a good source of information, potentially, of certain diseases that patients may have. For instance, if a patient has a disorder like meningitis or even some types of lymphoma, you can get indications that will indicate or will show that. In particular, you can have bacteria, you can have changes in the glucose concentration, you can also have cancer cells that are identified. So this is one of the conceptual diagrams of what the nervous system looks like. And when you look at some of these nerves, the peripheral nerves can literally be 1 meter or 2 long, and it's one large continuous nerve bundle of both motor, sensory nerves, which are traveling back to the spinal cord. You see here the spinal cord itself, and all the different nerves literally have to go to that information superhighway so they can be transmitted to the brain, which is typically the regulation center, the coordinating center that helps to maintain homeostasis. And we'll see, in particular, the hypothalamus and the brainstem are particularly important in regulating homeostatic function. This is an actual dissection diagram of a patient that shows the brain as well as the peripheral and central nervous system that has literally been dissected from an individual. All right, so protecting the brain, we have structures known as the meninges. The meninges include the pia, the arachnoid, and the dura mater, and we'll see that these meninges can literally, they provide a protective covering. The dura mater translates into tough mother because it's a covering that is relatively stiff, and it is, when you try to transect it or cut through it, it's a relatively tough structure to get through. The arachnoid membrane is more diaphanous, and it sort of looks like a spider web, hence the name arachnoid. The pia is sort of like a wrap of cellophane that is going around the brain sulci itself, and it covers that portion of the brain. The cerebrospinal fluid is located between the arachnoid and the pia in what's known as the subarachnoid space. This is a baby that has meningitis, and meningitis can be caused by different things. It can be bacterial meningitis, you can have fungal meningitis, you also have chemical meningitis. So there are many different types of meningitis that can occur, but certain types, for instance, meningococcus, which is caused by a bacteria, is particularly virulent, and the baby looks literally toxic. The baby becomes lethargic. Trying to bend the neck is very painful, so they can't touch their chin to the chest. It's really extremely painful to be able to do that. They typically have very severe headaches, and the disease can progress from in the morning till the evening such that the individual dies during that time. They can appear perfectly fine in the morning, and by the evening they can literally be so toxic and debilitated that they end up dying. So it's a particularly bad disease. So many people carry the meningococcal bacteria in their nasopharynx, and they get no problem from it, but when it's spread to other individuals, if there's an opening in between the nasopharynx and the brain, and there's some area that the bacteria can migrate their way through into the cerebrospinal fluid, you can actually get meningitis, and that can unfortunately kill the patient. And this is an example of what a patient who had meningitis and died from it. So you can see all sorts of pus. The bacteria makes the brain look cloudy, and it's obviously not a good situation, because once the bacteria start multiplying, it's a perfect environment to the bacteria, and they literally start growing logarithmically. There's a good supply of glucose, nutrients, and it's the perfect place that the bacteria live. And the brain, the immune system, doesn't typically make its way into the CSF, and you only have the glial cells that are capable of potentially getting rid of it, and they're quickly overwhelmed. So it's not able to do that job, and you literally start getting leakage of the blood-brain barrier. Antibodies can come in, but they're not going to be effective in getting rid of those bacteria. So this is what the meninges or the ventricles look like. So it's easier when we'll see a version where the brain is spinning around, but you have 4 different ventricles: the 3rd ventricle, the 4th ventricle. It goes all the way down through the spinal cord. So the brain literally floats in the cerebrospinal fluid, and you're constantly producing maybe 400 or 500 cc's of CSF per day. So you've also got to be able to resorb that. And in certain cases, this system where the CSF literally goes around the brain down and into the spinal cord or surrounding the spinal cord, the brain and the spinal cord float in that CSF. But if you get a blockage, it can literally start causing the head to start swelling, particularly in children. And older people, because many of the cranial sutures have been fused, you don't get that swelling, but you get increased pressure in the ventricles, and that can actually cause a lot of severe medical problems. So this is what the ventricles look like, and when you superimpose the brain on that, you can see that there are these hollow spaces within the brain, and within those hollow spaces are structures called the choroid plexus that literally secretes the cerebrospinal fluid, which is